Hi, Congregation Beth Am. It's Rabbi Rosenberg, and I'm speaking to you during a difficult week. It's still the time of pandemic and still a time of ongoing partial quarantine, which is making every day hard for just about all of us. But this has been a particularly hard week or so because a little more than a week ago, George Floyd was murdered. And in the wake of that murder, we've seen an endless stream of protests and some rioting and angry conversations and news reports and articles. For some of us, it's been dominating our lives for the past week, as it should be. It's been a horrifically difficult time for our society. One of the things that I did, along with other posts that I made on Facebook, yesterday I think it was, I posted a quote from the Talmud, one of my favorite quotes, many rabbis' favorite quotes. It's from Tractate Shabbat, and it teaches that if a person is able to protest the sins of his or her household, but chooses not to, then they are responsible for the sins of their household. And if they are able to protest the sins of their city, and they choose not to, then they are held responsible for the sins of their city. And if they are able to protest the sins of the entire world, but they choose not to, then they are held responsible for the sins of the entire world. Now, this is the teaching which often gets a lot of resistance from people because it goes against a lot of how we tend to think about guilt and responsibility in our culture. We are taught that individual responsibility is key. And there's a very positive side to that. By teaching the centrality of individual responsibility, we are teaching ourselves never to pass the buck. If I do something, I have to take responsibility for it. I can't blame somebody else, and that's a good thing. But it also teaches us that if someone else does something, that's only their responsibility, that I shouldn't take any responsibility for it because that's on them. And that's where Judaism differs. Judaism is pushing us to think about responsibility in a broader sense. I like that partially because it actually is logical. If you commit some bad act of any degree, and I could have stopped it, I could have done something to prevent you, or I could have at least spoken to you to try to stop it, and I chose not to do that, then I am one of the reasons that thing happened. I'm part of that story. I'm part of that chain of causation. I'm not equally guilty. I'm not equally responsible with the person who did the act, but I am, from, again, sort of a purely chain of causation point of view, I'm part of it. And I think that's important for us to think about. But I don't think that's the most important part of the teaching from Judaism. I think the most important part is getting us to think about how responsible we are for acting in the world. If we tell every single person that they are only responsible for the things that they themselves do, then my only real responsibility is to not do bad things. It's to live in my tiny little circle and hope that everything else works out. But that's not going to work. That's not how the world works. There is enough chaos out there, and there are enough bad people out there, that if each person only tries not to do harm, then there's going to be a lot of other harm being done. But if we put the responsibility on ourselves, if we say that our starting place is to assume that we are responsible to do everything that we can, not just to do harm, but to prevent harm. If we can actually convince a lot of the world to think that way, then we'll have a world filled with people who are actively trying to keep bad things from happening, trying to keep other bad people from doing bad things. By spreading that net of responsibility, we're turning us all into cogs in a machine in the name of good. And that's more important to me than the question of blame. Assigning blame, deciding who's most at fault, who should get punished, who should go to jail, that's an important conversation, but it's not the most important conversation. Talking about how we can make sure that these things don't happen in the first place, talking about how we can change our mindsets and then change our actions to prevent the most amount of pain, to ensure the most amount of goodness in the world, that seems to me to be a lot more important. By reminding myself that I am responsible for everything that I could have stopped or could have tried to stop but didn't, I put myself in the position of not doing the least harm, but of doing the most good. Our world is broken and our world is hurting, and it's not going to get better by itself. It's not going to get better by people simply sitting back and hoping that everyone does nothing bad. The world is only going to get better if people of good hearts and good conscience go out there and take responsibility for actively trying to make the world better. So as we get close to Shabbat, a time where we try and imagine a world redeemed, a world perfected, a world filled with only peace, hopefully we'll all think a little bit not only about what we've done, but about what we can do. And hopefully we'll finish this week and enter next week with a commitment to make our world as perfect and as holy as we possibly can. Take care, everybody.